When I first saw him standing there on the sidewalk, I thought nothing of it. I certainly didn't think that he'd still be out there come September. I lingered at the window for a moment, decided that the night-bound silhouette across the street was just some guy out for a walk, and so I went to my room and hid the hay. And as I stood blearily over the coffee maker the next morning, my eyes strayed up to the window over the sink, and a little shock of adrenaline removed the need for caffeine. He was still there, and still standing on the opposite side looking at my house. My roommates had all gone to work long ago, so I waited for my coffee, got dressed, and then approached the front door and peered through the peephole. He was still there. I took a deep breath, readying myself for whatever nonsense this was going to entail, and opened the door. His gaze shifted to me as soon as I stepped out onto the porch, and he watched me as I walked across the grass. He tensed when I stepped onto the sidewalk, but then looked relieved when I crossed it and reached the curb. Stopping there, I kept the pavement between us. I didn't know how exactly to ask him what the hell he was doing. "Hey, what's up?" He looked a little nervous. "Nothing. Just hanging out." From where I was standing, he didn't appear to be homeless or crazy. He was a man of about 40 dressed in a dark blue robe, and I vaguely recognized him. "Don't you live in that house?" I pointed up the driveway behind him, and he nodded. "Yep, that's mine. Just came out to get the newspaper." And I glanced down at his hand, where he held an orange bag with the newspaper rolled up inside. "Well, looks like you got it." I paused. Another orange bag was lying further up the driveway, as if the one that he was holding was actually yesterday's. And he didn't say anything. He just stood there with a masked, nervous expression. "Did I see you out here last night, too?" I asked. "Yep, that was me." I looked down further, and I saw that his feet were bare. "You weren't out here all night, were you?" And I expected him to laugh at the idea, but instead he replied, "I was." "You been out here all night in bare feet?" Panic was oozing from under the mask of calm politeness in a dozen different ways. "Yes." Now I was starting to feel more than a little weird. "Are you gonna stand out here all day, too?" He strained to speak, but then seemed to change his reply. "I might. It's beautiful weather out." Well, that much was true. It was a warm summer day, bright and beautiful. "Well, could you at least not stare at my house then?" He began to give an apologetic shrug, but stopped halfway through the motion and tried to turn. His bare feet never lifted from the sidewalk. The attempted turn was more of a twist from the thighs up. And that, too, stopped rather quickly. And then he said, His gaze moved in circles before he finally looked directly at me. "Your house looks nice. I like looking at it." By then, I was getting rather annoyed. "What's your name?" "Russ." "Russ? Nice to meet you." I shook my head. I've never had to do this before. "If you don't stop being weird and staring at my house, I'm gonna have to call the police." And his eyes lit up. "Yes, please do that." And that was a weird enough reaction that I actually got out my phone. I've been raised to never involve the police for any reason, but this was abnormal enough that I felt that I had to. I told the dispatcher that we had a strange man standing outside our house and that he'd been there literally all night. Yes, all night. She said that 2 officers would be with us shortly. Russ and I didn't talk much while waiting for them. He just stood there looking at me at random times and around the neighborhood otherwise. Ours was a quiet street populated by nice people who kept mostly to themselves. We never really had cause to really meet each other. If we had, I might have known more about Russ. But as things were, he was just some man acting strangely. Although, his aura of masked nervousness calmed as a squad car turned down the lane and approached us. 2 uniformed officers climbed out and approached us with tired stances. One asked dismissively, "What seems to be the problem, gentlemen?" Russ looked to me hopefully, and I told them, "This guy's been standing here staring at our house all night long." The second cop rolled his eyes, but he did ask Russ, "That true, sir?" Russ gulped and stated, "Yes." Both cops straightened at the unexpected answer. The first one asked, "Seriously?" Russ nodded. The second cop looked at us for a moment and then said, "Well, move it along then." Russ tensed and stood a little taller. "No." "What?" I said no. As the pair began walking toward him, he added, "Sir." As one got out their handcuffs, the other sneered and said, "Listen, asshole." But he stopped about 2 feet from Russ. His partner froze as well. "Come on," Russ urged them. "What are you waiting for?" "Come on." The 2 men looked at each other with haunted expressions, and then began to back away. The handcuffs returned to their belt. "No!" Russ shouted at them. "Do it, you pricks! You pigs! Ugly bastards! Come on! Beat me up! Teach me a lesson! Knock me down!" The first cop's face was pale. "You're fine, sir. You're absolutely right. We're pigs. Just do what you like. Stand there as long as you want. You're on your property, technically, so this is none of our business." The second glanced at me with apologetic terror. Both jumped in their car and peeled away. Russ screamed incoherently after them, but did not move from his spot on the sidewalk. I called the station a second time to ask what had happened, but after taking my address, the dispatcher told me to never call again, and hung up. The anger faded out of Russ as he saw me lower the phone, and I stood there awkwardly as the grown man across the street began to outright cry. I've never seen a 41-year-old man blubber from sheer hopeless terror. "Russ, what is going on?" He couldn't answer past his tears. Looking left and right first, I finally stepped out onto the street and I got near him. I had the strangest notion, but I couldn't articulate it. The words simply wouldn't come to mind. An instinctual awareness was the most that I could manage, and I did reach the opposite curb right in front of him. And I was intent on pushing him back off the spot on the sidewalk, but I changed my mind about 2 feet from him. It would have been weird to touch a crying grown man. I stepped back to the street. Confused, I tried a second time. At 2 feet away from him, literally within arm's reach. I changed my mind again. He could do what he liked. Who was I to interfere if he wanted to stand outside on a beautiful day? Each time that I got close and then changed my mind, his tears and terror deepened. I remember murmuring, "All right, screw this," and I backed up to the middle of the street to get space for a running start. I couldn't articulate what I was doing, but I guessed that a leaping tackle might work. I braced myself and then I launched forward, ready to spring up at the proper distance. But as I went to jump at him, I changed my mind. There was nothing wrong and I was just being silly. Who cared about any of this? And I slowed and I curved away. And his sobbing became a river. Despite an overwhelming sense that something was very wrong, I turned and I slowly went back inside. And I could still see him through the kitchen window, and I began going about my business of the day and muted horror that I could not acknowledge gnawing at my heart. Each time that I looked, I would hope against hope that he had moved, but he was always there, shaking and crying and looking around for help. And that was in June. A pall hung over our neighborhood, where once my roommates and I had held board game parties and had a dozen people over. Now we ate meager meals in silence. Whenever one of us would think to talk about something that had happened at work, or perhaps an event where we were looking forward to it, whenever one of us would think to talk about something that had happened at work, or perhaps an event that we were looking forward to, we would get out about half of a sentence and then be overwhelmed by a sense of hollowness. Who cared about a concert or a trip to a water park at a time like this? We would stop our sentence midway through and glance out the kitchen window as a group. Always, Russ was still standing there. He successfully avoided dangerous sunburns by lifting his robe over his head during the brightest hours, and he had a few nearby trees to shade him at other times. His bare feet took the worst of it, and were red and boiled over after a week. During that second week, we gathered daily as a neighborhood. It was impossible not to have noticed him standing out there by then, and all the various residents of our street wandered out to speak to him and to one another about various polite topics with strained undertones. "Terrible weather," a neighbor would say, her eyes fearful. The weather was gorgeous and beautiful. "Absolutely terrible weather," another of us would say. "Horrifying, in fact. What the hell is happening with the weather?" I remember the oldest of us, a woman who had lived through the Great Depression and was normally tough as nails, then cried openly and sobbed. "Why is the weather doing this?" Russ stood through all of this, visibly hopeful and terrified. The old woman screamed at him. "Why don't you go inside?" He could only shrug and shakily tell her, "I don't want to go inside. I like sunburns on my feet." She approached with both hands up to throttle him, but changed her mind as she came within reach. "You're a man. You can take it. It shouldn't interrupt your enjoyment of nature." She hobbled away in tears, trembling violently. Another of our neighbors stepped forward. "At least take these clothes." He held a folded shirt and a pair of jeans forward, but turned away before getting close enough to hand them over. You probably don't want my old hand-me-downs." "Right," Russ replied hopelessly. "I'm fine. Thanks, though." It was the rainy season in our parts, and it began to drizzle on our heads, so we retreated to our homes to gaze out the window and watch Russ thirstily hold open his mouth to the sky. Once the torrent was heavy enough, he could also lean down and scoop water from the flow running along the curb. And that gave us an idea. As a neighborhood, we began to wash our cars more and more often. The runoff from the hoses would flow past Russ, allowing him to drink and stay alive, but only for as long as would normal for washing one's car. None of us mentioned it to one another. We just saw others doing it, and so we did it too. The rainy season also brought worms up to the ground, which he ate, and he learned to stand still long enough for birds to come near. He would grab them and eat them whole. The sidewalk near him became foul with waste until each new rain washed it clear. One of the men on the street began building a long wood and metal contraption, and for the first time in a month, we had something else to see outside our windows. And we watched him for nearly a week before getting a sense of what he was doing. It was a massively long Rube Goldberg machine of levers, swinging hammers, rolling balls, and other assorted nonsense. From the 2x4s he'd laid out, he'd planned for it to extend all the way down the street, around the corner, and out of sight. My roommates and I took a few days off and wordlessly began helping. The older woman in the neighborhood brought out drinks and food for us. And Russ looked on while we ate and drank, but he watched especially carefully while we worked. I'd never been one for tools, but I muddled through in figuring out how to saw and nail things effectively, and the other men in the neighborhood joined us without a word when they saw how serious we were. It took 6 days, but we finally finished the contraption on the eve of a big storm. And as the sky was growing dark, we gathered around the corner out of sight of Russ and stared at the button that would activate the machine. If all the levers and hammers and contraptions worked, Russ would be knocked over by a battering ram mechanism at the very end. And we stared at the button. A jogger approached and we stared at her. She slowed and looked worried that 30-odd people were watching her. We backed up and glanced at the button repeatedly. "You want me to push this?" she asked, cautious but concerned. "Is this for some sort of prank video?" We looked at each other, and the old woman who had survived the Great Depression shrugged and nodded. The jogger moved close and hovered her hand over the button before backing up. "Nah, I'd rather not participate in a prank video." Her expression was fearful and pained. She jogged on as we stood in despair. The storm came and destroyed most of the mechanisms. The man who started it looked down in grief-stricken silence over the course of the next week. Russ watched the process with despondent eyes. A moving truck pulled up one morning, and we gathered on the street to watch his wife begin packing things. "Russ lost his job because he stopped showing up," she explained. "And now we can't afford this place anymore." She looked over at him with narrowed eyes and said hatefully, "I don't understand why he's doing this. But I'm not staying with an unemployed loser who would rather stand around all day than do some honest work. This is honest work, he called over, crying despite his words. It's tough standing here without rest. I do get rest, but someone has to do it. We watched her put Russ's son in the passenger seat and then drive off with most of the contents of his house. And then we looked at Russ. He gulped, wiped his tears away, and gave the flimsiest reason I'd yet heard. It's more important that I stand here than go after my family. I don't value them anymore. He seemed to give up after that, letting the sun sear his flesh day after day and not even bothering to eat the worms that followed each storm. And that was July. The first party our street had seen in months nearly sparked a riot. Our place was one of the two that the street designated as off-campus housing, and the other house kicked off a kegger at about 7 o'clock one night. Outrage and anger flowed with us onto the foyer of that house. The college guys therein turned down the music and had their friends hang back a second as the entire neighborhood crowded in. The old woman asked, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Having a party," one of the guys responded. "What's the problem? We're not being loud." I was actually the one who had spoke next. I remember my righteous anger vividly. "How can you have a party when things are the way that they are?" One of the guys who lived there protested. "So what? We're supposed to just stop everything and not live our lives because things are the way that they are?" And the guests looked at us in confusion. The most painful part about that argument was that the guys were right. We couldn't just stop living our lives because of what happened on our street. The shouts and the yells from each side were more about how we felt than logical debate. And a fistfight broke out just long enough to knock over the keg and break 2 glasses. We held each other back and retreated as a neighborhood, leaving the college guys to their party. I was bitter. So bitter, and we all felt that bitterness together. Until another neighborhood had a party 2 nights later. A week after that, one of our roommates had our friends over for a board game night. And I had to admit that it felt like such a relief to return to normalcy. At the end of the night, I walked the last of our friends out, and we had one last joke and laugh, and then waved after them. Russ was just a silhouette in the darkness, always there but no longer on our minds all the time. Of course, the next morning the guilt hit me like a load of bricks, and I stood over my coffee maker and studied the boil-covered red scarecrow across the street. His blue robes were growing tattered after months outside, and he looked like a burned corpse. Unfortunately, I had a stressful day ahead, and I couldn't afford to process my guilt at the moment. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was the one who did it. I closed the blinds over the kitchen window. It was supposed to have been just for the day, just so that way I could get through the big project at hand. But the blinds never came back up after that, and as a house, as a group, we stopped looking out the window. Just like washing our cars, just like working on that Rube Goldberg machine, and just like our overreaction to the party. My neighbors took that as a cue. Within 5 days, all of the blinds on all of the windows on our entire street were closed. The first night that Russ was completely alone outside in the dark. With all of the blinds closed, an absolute guarantee that nobody was looking out for him or at him, I laid in my bed and stared at the ceiling and cried quietly. This was not like the other pains on this street, not like the ones that couldn't be articulated. I knew exactly what I had done this time, and I could think and say the words since it was my issue and my guilt alone. I was the first one to close the blinds. I wanted to be the first one to raise them again, look out upon our neighborhood problem and force everyone else to open their eyes and unite once again. But I didn't have the courage. I needed to work. I needed to pay rent. I couldn't be the one, because raising my blinds would mean acknowledging the problem, and I couldn't afford to be racked by guilt and confusion and pain any longer. Each night I prayed that someone else would be the first to raise their blinds. Surely someone would do it. It was the only conscientious path, and someone would definitely feel compelled to do the right thing. Then, we could all do it together. I put the entire issue out of my thoughts for so long that I was actually startled when I saw Russ healthier than before. With nobody mowing his lawn or trimming his trees, and with an abnormally rainy season, the greenery around him had grown to shade him nearly the entire day. His skin was back to a decent color where crinkled parchment had peeled off, and a large number of crickets and other bugs had taken up residence in his waist-high lawn. On these, he fed, reaching down to grab insects at a random and eat them when the urge struck him. I looked because a car had pulled up, and I watched as a real estate lady got out and began pestering him. "Hey!" I shouted from across the way, defensive over our issue. "You leave Russ alone!" "This is ridiculous," she called back. "I need to sell this property, and I'm never going to get a buyer interested in a property with a weathered homeless man standing outside of it." "He's not homeless," I shouted at her. "That's his home." "Not anymore. His wife got it in the divorce because he failed to show up to the hearings." I don't know why I said it. "I meant the sidewalk." Somehow, at some unknown point, I'd accepted it as simply the way things were. The real estate lady glared down at me and then at Russ, and then she got in her car and left. I knew what would happen next, and my roommates and I harassed the landscaping crew that she had sent until she got fed up and left too. If they mowed the lawn and pruned the trees, Russ would be in serious trouble. We congratulated ourselves for a job well done and went back into our house for board game night. That was in August. The derisive talk began earlier this month. As the first chill of autumn hit the air, I think people knew instinctively that the worst was yet to come for him. Whenever we happened to glance his way, someone would split up and call him an idiot for standing there like that. "Why doesn't he just go inside?" someone would ask. "Yeah, what a dumbass," someone else would say. And I stared at them while they said these things like that. I did wish that it would stop, that he would stop, but I don't know. I just don't know. I was prompted to write this and share our situation because I saw it in myself. I saw my feelings turning towards blame and hatred. I asked the same questions. Why was he doing this? Why didn't he just go inside? That strange dread notion that I could not articulate drove me to go outside and do something no one else had done in weeks. Talk to him. "Hey, Russ," I said by way of opening, since I had no idea what else to say. His hair was a mane and his beard was wild, but there was still a man under there. He coughed and cleared his throat and then managed to say, "Hey." There was really no beating around the bush. "You gave up for a little while there, didn't you?" And he nodded weakly. "What changed your mind? Why are you eating and drinking again? Why do you fight so hard to survive?" I asked him, my heart full of compassion. I felt like I was such a great person for caring when nobody else did. I never forgot his bemused, angry laugh. He tilted his head and he said, "To stick it to you assholes." That was the one answer that I never expected. We'd done so much for him, gone through so much guilt and angst and effort, but I guess I never thought about what it was like on the other side of the blinds. Standing there night after night knowing the entire neighborhood was avoiding looking at you. I don't have an answer. I don't have any answers. I wanted to tell him good luck, but it would have just sounded hollow. I nodded and I went inside. This time, I raised the blinds and I stood by the kitchen window. As the first flakes of snow for the season began to fall, I accepted his angry gaze. Would the heat of his hate be enough to keep him warm through the winter? Summer seemed impossibly far away, especially without so much as a blanket. And yet all of the people who came over, all of my friends and roommates and acquaintances, all just kept asking idly, why doesn't he just go inside? If only it were that simple. The air off Lake Erie felt different at night. Heavier, somehow, carrying secrets on a damp breeze. Our vacation cabin usually felt like a refuge, cozy despite the peeling paint. But that night, the woodsy scent couldn't cover the sour tension hanging in the air. Dinner had been a disaster. Another stupid fight about, I don't even remember what. Grades, friends, whatever it was, it ended with me yelling something regrettable and storming off to my room. the slam of my door echoing my frustration. Later, cocooned in my teenage angst into the glow of my phone, I heard it. Retching sounds, violent and guttural, coming from the hallway bathroom. I hesitated, the leftover anger wearing with concern. Finally, I crept to the door and knocked softly. Mom? You okay? Silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant lapping of lake water against the shore. And then, her voice, flat and devoid of any inflection, slid under the door. I'm fine, honey. A pause. I'm feeling much better now. Something about the monotone, the utter lack of her usual warmth, sent a prickle down my spine. I retreated back to my room, unsettled, pushing the feeling away as exhaustion finally claimed me. I woke to a sound that didn't belong. Rhythmic and insistent, coming down the hall. It wasn't frantic, more methodical, heavy. My heart hammered against my ribs. Slowly and quietly, I eased my bedroom door open just a crack. The hallway light was off, but the moonlight filtering through the living room window cast long, eerie shadows. I saw her. Mom. She was standing in front of my little sister Lily's door, slamming her forehead against the solid wood. Mom? My voice was a trembling whisper, barely audible. Then she stopped. Slowly and agonizingly, her head began to turn towards me, but it didn't stop at her shoulder. It kept going. A sickening crackle like snapping twigs amplified in the dead quiet, echoed as her neck twisted impossibly far. 180 degrees. Her eyes wide and vacant in the dim light, staring directly at me from above her backward-facing shoulders. And then her arms shot backwards, elbows bending the wrong way, fingers splayed like talons reaching for me, and she started moving, running backwards down the hall, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floor with horrifying speed. I slammed my door shut, fumbling with the lock I rarely used. The thump, thump, thump started again, this time against my door, harder now, splintering the frame. It was violent, enraged. And then, abruptly, it stopped. Silence again. Thick and suffocating. Honey? Her voice was sickeningly sweet now, but still utterly flat, seeping through the wood. Let me in. I'm sorry if I scared you. A pause. I'm feeling much better now. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing against the wall, trying not to breathe. Open the door, sweetie. The voice cooed, devoid of any real emotion. And when I didn't answer, didn't make a sound. The violent slamming resumed, shaking the entire door in its frame, but the voice didn't change. It kept up its calm, monotone requests even as the wood groaned under the assault. Please, honey, I just want to talk. And suddenly a piercing scream cut through the night. Lily. Down the hall. Instinct took over. Fear for my sister momentarily eclipsed my own terror. I wrenched the door open. That thing that was my mother stumbled slightly at the sudden lack of resistance. Without thinking, I shoved hard. It tumbled backwards, limbs flailing unnaturally down the short flight of stairs leading to the living room. I didn't wait to see it land. I sprinted to Lily's room, throwing open her door. Lily! The room was dark, save for the moonlight stripping the floor. And in the center, a figure was crouched low, its back to me. Dad? The figure jerked, standing up in a way that wasn't quite human. Jerky, unnatural, like a puppet whose strings were tangled. and it turned. It wasn't just Dad. His face. It looked like it was melting. His familiar features contorted and stretched while the other seemed to be Lily's face. Pulled taut. Eyes wide with an agony I couldn't comprehend. They were merging, becoming one grotesque entity. Its mouth stretched open, wider than any human mouth should, and instead of a scream, thick, viscous black tentacles retched out, accompanied by a high-pitched electronic screech that drilled into my skull. I didn't scream. I just ran. Down the hall and past the twisted heap at the bottom of the stairs that was no longer my mother, ignoring the scrabbling sounds that it made. Out of the front door into the cool, damp night air, I ran into the woods behind the cabin, branches tearing at my pajamas, bare feet stinging on the rocks and roots. I didn't look back. I just ran, fueled by pure primal terror, until the blackness began to bleed into the gray of dawn. I collapsed somewhere near the highway. And that's where the police found me. Shivering and incoherent. They took me back to the cabin. It was empty. Clean. No sign of a struggle, no broken doors, no Dad Lily thing. Nothing. Except a trail of something dark and sticky leading from the back porch down the edge of Lake Erie, disappearing into the water. Mom, Dad, Lily. Officially listed as missing. Drowned, perhaps. That's what the reports suggested. But the looks that the officers gave each other, the way that they avoided my eyes, they knew something was wrong. They just didn't know what. Or maybe they did. And didn't want to say. Lake Erie holds its secrets well. They sent me away, of course. Who wouldn't believe such a story? Psych ward to psych ward, therapist to therapist, they tried to explain it away. Trauma, hallucinations, a psychotic break brought on by family stress. And for years I almost believed them. But I know what I saw. I know what happened in that cabin by the lake. And I'm telling you now because, well, I'm feeling much better now.